Meanwhile, the FBI says extremists are threatening to attack courthouses and state capitals across the country if President Trump is removed from office early. Washington, D.C. is beefing up security ahead of President-elect Biden's inauguration January 20th. President Trump granted an emergency declaration for D.C., freeing up federal agencies to respond to any potential violence. And the first of up to 15,000 National Guard troops have already been deployed to the city. That warning from the FBI will be top of mind as Texas lawmakers head to the Capitol today for the first day of the 87th Texas legislature. And there are also concerns about the coronavirus. Erica Zuko is joining us now with more on what's being done to make sure the start of this session goes smoothly. Erica, good morning.
Good morning, Sarah. Yeah, Texas lawmakers say they're concerned about safety both as it pertains to health and security, especially as word comes that there may be protests at the state capitol today. Some worries that those could potentially get out of hand. And State Senator Jose Menendez of San Antonio posted a tweet with a letter that he says that he sent to the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House asking for them to ban guns on that first day of this session. He says that the Texas Department of Public Safety did let lawmakers know that protests could be happening, people who are questioning the legitimacy of the November election. And in addition to all of that, there are the normal concerns about security at the Capitol. When asked about it during a news conference yesterday that was mostly about vaccine distribution, what the governor had to say was pretty cut and dry.
Well, first, with regard to security of the Capitol, listen, that's something that the Texas Department of Public Safety always remains on top of, and they will continue to remain on top of that.
And of course, there are those concerns about coronavirus. Lawmakers will still be meeting in person this session. Today, anyone who goes to the state capitol will be required to get a coronavirus test before going in. We'll see how long all of that takes. And we're still watching to see what rules lawmakers decide on in terms of virtual meetings and virtual testimony for this session. Reporting in San Antonio, Erica Zuko, KENS 5 Eyewitness News.